Hello, everybody. My name's Paul Deis, and I'm a railroad modeler like the rest of you. I've been modeling in different scales ever since I was a wee child. My earliest childhood memory is my dad's Lionel, which was in the basement bedroom I shared with my brothers. He only set it up at Christmas time, which was usually he set it up in August and maybe took it down in July and then set it right back up again. So I've been modeling in a variety of scales since the early 60s. Did O27, N scale, HO 1 to 20. I also now currently model in HO and 7.5-inch gauge. And I volunteer at a 2-foot gauge actual railroad. What I want to do today is help you avoid pulling your hair out. As you can see, I've pulled mine out over the years. And help you avoid that by figuring out things we can do to your rolling stock to make them operate more reliably. So we're going to go through what I have found that works for me, and it's one way of doing things. It may not be the absolute perfect, or it may not be the way you choose to do it, but it's what worked for me. So here we go. So when we tune up our rolling stock, I like to look at different components: the couplers, the trucks, the wheels, the weight of the car, and also give you some ideas on the tools that I have found over my time that I've collected that work well for me. But how do we know what to work on? Well, what I did is I reached out to a lot of people that hold operating sessions and said, other than a knucklehead running backwards through a switch, what do you find to be the most common cause of problems that you have to go solve on your railroad during an operating session? One of the reasons I wanted to do that is your operators do not blush at telling you what's wrong. If there's something wrong, they'll tell you. And I ask my operators to do that. I give them little pink tags to put around the railroad. I tell them to bad order a card and fill out a little piece of paper to tell me what's gone wrong so I can fix it before the next session. Well, I was kind of surprised when I got the results, and that's what's on the screen. Most of the problems people have during operating sessions are due to couplers, misaligned couplers, uncoupling of dissimilar couplers, a variety of other one-off coupler problems. Then there were some problems with the way the car rolls, problems with the trucks, dirty wheels, wheel gauge, wheels not free rolling. And the one that caused the least problem, which I was real happy to see, is car weight. And we'll talk about why I am not too worried about car weight on how I operate my railroad. One thing to think about is this hobby's been around for a long time. Things have changed over time. We used to have X2F couplers, and before that, we had a variety of every brand had its own coupler. And the X2F was the first chance that we took to try to standardize. Sure, they worked for everybody, but they really didn't work well for coupling or uncoupling. They didn't look realistic. Then along came Katie. Katie came out with their knuckle coupler, which has changed over the years. And in my opinion, they're the gold standard on couplers. And there are other companies now that make a Katie compatible couplers. It's been around for a while, and there's some problems with those. Some of the problems we'll look at is plastic develops a memory if it's held under stress. Plastic isn't as strong. Another thing we'll look at is a Katie came out with over time, and they keep updating a conversion list. Modern, if you buy a new kit today or a new piece of rolling stock today, a standard Katie number 5 or one of their whisker couplers will drop right in. But if you've got a steam engine and you need to change out a pilot coupler, or you got some old rolling stock, the standard number 5 coupler isn't right. Well, Katie on their website publishes a list. If you got this car, use this coupler. Another thing I want to look at is the standard head coupler versus the scale head. The scale head is smaller. It's more realistic in size compared to the car. And you can couple the standard head and the scale head couplers together. They work fine, they don't uncouple. But when you're in an operating session, they tend to cause a little bit more difficulty in doing uncoupling. So let's look at those couplers. So this is a Katie ad that they put out. they did some testing. They hung weight from the couplers to see how they held up under some weight. So they took their plastic coupler and hung more than 12 pounds for 24 hours from it with no change in the coupler. They're 58s, which is the smaller head coupler. Same thing, no problem. They used some of the plastic knockoff couplers and they deformed almost immediately. People go, well, I'm not going to be hanging 3 pounds from my couplers. Well, take a train that you normally run and put it on your steepest grade and pull it with your fingers. You'll be surprised how much weight you're actually pulling. Another problem that Katie didn't talk about here happened on a club layout that I was visiting. They had left a train parked overnight on a downhill grade. And when they went to move that train the next day, when it hit the flats, it uncoupled. They recoupled it, uncoupled in a different spot. And what they found is when the train was compressed, some of the couplers that had plastic whisker springs, that whisker spring got a memory and the coupler stayed deflected to the side. So once you got some slack in the train, the coupler flipped to the side and the train uncoupled. So what I have done is I have standardized on KD couplers. I most often use the number 5 or the new number 58s, which is like the number 5, but with the whisker couplers. And if I have anything with a plastic coupler, I toss it. One of the reasons that you might need a plastic coupler, if you have old locomotives, old Athearn locomotives are a good example. You can't have metal couplers on 2 locomotives that are backwards to each other on the railroad unless you've isolated the electrical system from the frame. Otherwise, you'll see sparks. So that's a time when you would want a plastic coupler. But KD's plastic couplers tend to hold up well. So that's why I use KD. Here's an example. This is my coupler storage box. It's got a variety of oddball KD couplers. Every once in a while, I'll find that I have to figure out what'll work for a particular old piece of rolling stock or a scratch-built car I made, or more commonly for the pilot on a steam locomotive. I can't tell you how many years I've had this box. There's even up in the upper left corner some KD number 4s. If you've never seen one, you ought to just go look at it just to see some history. It's a totally different mechanism inside that coupler, and it's KD's first idea on how to make a coupler work. Now that you got the right coupler, it has to be mounted correctly and maintained correctly. One of the biggest problems is coupler height, and it's also fairly easy to fix. But unless you test every car, you don't know you have a problem with coupler heights. So every car on my railroad, before it goes on the railroad, one of the things I check it for is the height of the coupler. I want it centered on the coupler gauge. The trip pin, what looks like an air hose hanging underneath, has to clear the little clearance gauge on the KD coupler height gauge. And of course, it has to have a functioning knuckle spring in the coupler. On the lower left side, you see that kind of reddish tool with some masking tape on it that's holding a spring. That's the original KD tool they came out with for holding those knuckle springs. If you've ever tried any other way to put those in, you find out that they fly a long ways and you never find them again. KD stopped making that tool. I really have no idea how many decades old mine is, but I've been using it forever. Well, in the upper right corner is a tool that works the same kind of idea by Micromark. Works great. It'll hold that coupler spring really nice for you while you put it in place. Another problem with the couplers is how they're installed. We'll start out by Athearn. Athearn used to use a metal clip to hold their couplers in place. And occasionally those clips would pop off the car or come loose from the car, and either the coupler would fall off or the coupler would hang low. Well, a company called A-Line came out with a way to fix that, which also works great for other cars that don't have those metal clips, that have a variety of other ways of holding the coupler in. Kind of the golden rule is don't rely on anything other than a screw that you have tightened to hold your coupler in place. Don't use a friction pin. Don't use any other kind of compression. So let's look at this A-line tool. First thing you do is if you're dealing with the old Athearn is you got to pop that metal clip off of it. And then the A-line tool has two brass spacers, a number 256 tap, and a small drill bit. The idea is you take the brass sleeve, you put it over that little coupler protrusion, the centering post. That brass piece will keep your drill bit centered, and you drill a hole through the center of that post. Then you change to the other brass sleeve, and you use the 256 tap, and you cut threads into that post. Here I'm using it to do it on a tank car from Athearn. Drilling the hole, see the hole going through, and then taking the tap and tapping the threads. Then the kit comes with 1/8 inch long 256 blackened screws. I think the kit comes with about a dozen of them. Well, I've got a couple hundred pieces of rolling stock on my railroad. So I found on Amazon I could get in bags of 100 of those screws quite inexpensively, blackened number 256 by 1/8 inch long. So that screw will then hold either the original Kadee metal cover plate back on or whatever other brand you have. And we'll look at another one here. Here's one on the upper right that I did to a car that didn't have a coupler boss, or I think actually in this one it broke off. And so that's how I used a Kadee box to mount it. On the left top is another piece that you want to think about is lubricating the couplers with Kadee Greasem. Greasem is powdered graphite. You can also get powdered graphite that's made for lubricating a padlock at your locksmith store. At the bottom is a tank car where it actually uses the bottom strap of the frame to hold the coupler in place. Those are notorious for that plastic piece bending down over time, causing your coupler to droop, which then causes derailments or causes uncoupling. So you can also use that same A-line tool to fix that. The difference is you need to also get a slightly larger drill bit, a number 50, and you have to drill a hole through the cover to have clearance for that 256 screw. You don't want a tight hole where it's going to actually grab the threads, because then as you tighten it, it'll lift the lid off. You want to drill a slightly larger hole than the number 256, which is a number 50 screw. Here's an example of another brand of car where it had a friction pin, or I should say a friction fit. Again, I took the drill bit and drilled that hole that's in the upper right picture, and then tapped it for the 256. I drilled a hole with the number 50 bit through the cover, and then used my 256 screw to hold the coupler in place. So that's couplers. The next thing that people have problems with is derailments caused by problems with the wheels. Well, that's been a lot of change over time. The go-to set of wheels years ago was Central Valley's wheels. They were sprung couplers. They looked pretty nice. They rolled nice. They had metal wheels, but the springs on the sides were a little oversized. Athearn also made sprung wheel sets. They were also oversized. And actually the springing motion in both of those sets of trucks doesn't really work well with the weight, the light weight that we have in an HO piece of rolling stock. So I've gone to all solid frame wheel sets. And if we mount them correctly, you get enough movement out of the wheel set to deal with any undulations in your track. First thing you want to do with a set of trucks is inspect them. If you look at them and go, what the heck is this? This thing's just like a piece of junk. It's way oversized. It's got mismatched parts. The holes aren't centered. Throw it in the trash. If it has flashing, flashing is where a mold starts to wear out. And when they pump the plastic into the mold, a little bit squeezes out between the two halves of the mold. If it's only a thin layer of flashing, you can take a knife and clean those off. Another problem that can happen is warped coupling, warped trucks, especially at a kit that maybe you bought used from somebody else that's been in somebody's garage for 10 years in the heat and it's warped. Throw that one out. One of the key tools I like to use is a truck tuner. I believe the one I have was from Micromark, or it could have been from Reeboks. There's a few different people out there that sell them. It's a steel piece with a sharpened end that fits into one side of the truck, and the other end is a cutting edge that fits into the opposite boss on the truck. Now, how do you use them? You take out the wheel set, you place the truck tuner in, you turn it, you squeeze it gently and turn it slowly, and you'll feel if there's any flash or any little protrusions inside that bearing surface. As you turn it, you'll feel them get cut away. This isn't meant to cut a whole new shape in there. It's just meant to clean out any stuff. And you're going to be really surprised when you first use one of these that stuff's going to come out. I mean, who would have thought there'd be little tiny bits of flash or little imperfections? It makes a huge difference to clean these. So it takes a few minutes. You put it in one side, you flip it over, then you do the other side and flip it over again. It's amazing how much nicer your wheels will roll. Mounting the trucks. The go-to way for many, many years was called the 3-point mount. You put your trucks on, you tighten one till it just swivels back and forth nice. You take the other truck and you loosen it a little bit so it can rock in all directions. That actually works pretty good. I found another way that I think works even better. We set up what's called gimbals. We set it up so one set of trucks rocks fore and aft, but not side to side. The other truck rides side to side. Another thing with the trucks is no friction pins. Must be held in by screws. So let's look at those truck washers. They're made by a company called Proto 87. I have no stock in the company. I just happen to like their components. They're an incredibly thin stainless steel washer that has little bumps on opposite sides of each washer. And you take your truck off and you glue those over the center boss that your truck is going to be attached to. Just a little bit of ACC, and then you drop it over the pin. And you're going to put one facing across the car and one in line with the car. That way, again, one truck will rock from side to side. The other truck will rock fore and aft. I put those on, then I tighten the screw down till it bottoms out, and then I back it off a quarter of a turn. Trucks will spin back and forth nice and easy, plus they'll do that rocking back and forth and get across any problem track work you have. On some cars, again, especially the old Atherns, that stud that you drop the wheels on was considerably longer than it needed to be. It was so that if you overzealously tightened it, your truck would still spin around. But they're so loose, the truck is just floppy in there. So I take a chisel blade and just shave a little bit off of it to shorten it. Wheels. Metal wheels. All I can say is metal wheels. Use metal wheels. Did you hear me? Let's go with metal wheels. Why? Well, they do a couple of things for you. Plastic wheels are lighter in weight. Plastic wheels tend to get gunked up with stuff off your track. The metal wheels gives a little bit more weight down low, weight that isn't bouncing back and forth up in the car. They're easier to clean. And if you're like me, where I use detection on parts of my railroad for part of my dispatching system, you can add resistors to the wheels. There's a variety of brands of metal wheels out there. Your flavor can vary. On the bottom left is the Katie metal wheels. I used those exclusively for a lot of years. And then I actually found on some trains that had run a long time, they were having problems. And I found that the plastic point was damaged. The other problem with the Katie wheels is they're a sintered metal with paint on them, some kind of paint coating, or if not paint, it might be some chemical coating. But as you start to run those, I used to think it was cool. They get that nice shiny spot down the middle on the tread. Well, the problem is that nice shiny spot is there because that black stuff has worn off, and is all over your track. Myself, I prefer to Intermountain wheels. Not to say that they're that much greater than any other metal wheel, but it's what I standardized on. I do like the metal axles and I do like the metal wheels. Another thing you want to look at with wheels, it really doesn't matter what you have if they don't fit. So the first thing you want to do is check every wheel you have, every axle you have against the NMRA gauge. Well, I remember years ago, I was building Walther's cars, back then with plastic wheels on metal axles, and almost every single axle was out of gauge. So I check them all. Axle lengths. There was a company, unfortunately, I believe they're gone now, called Reeboks, that really pushed hard on the idea of putting the right length axle so your wheels don't go from side to side. In testing that we did at a club I was in, we found that if you put in the correct metal wheels, metal axles, the right length, the cars would roll forever. Well, Reeboks isn't around anymore, but there are other companies that have different axle lengths. So you can still do that if you want to. Myself, I've given up on it, and I'm just using my standard wheels from Intermountain. You want to test roll your trucks and your wheels. Just put your finger on top of it, roll it back and forth, a piece of test track. You'll feel right away if it's not rolling smooth or if there's a wobble. If there is, fix it before you put it on your car. That piece of metal in my hand is, if you don't have one, shame on you. You need to have a standards gauge. You can use it for so many things on your layout, but in this case, we're talking about your wheel gauge, making sure it's correct. If it doesn't drop in those two slots, another set of wheels. If you are going to try to deal with the axle lengths, get a caliper so you can determine the actual length. On the right side was Reebok sold a sample pack. It was one axle of every size that they made. You might still find those on eBay or in a hobby shop, and you might still find some of their wheels. How about car weight? This is another NMRA standard that people lived or died by for many years. Well, why did the NMRA have that standard? We used to be dealing with cars that weren't made as nice and fine tooling as we have now. We had track work that was mostly snap track. So the idea is if I get all my cars to weigh the same amount per inch of length, then my train will roll real nice. The problems you run into if you don't follow that rule, if you have cars that are too heavy, you can't pull as many cars up the hill. If you have really heavy cars at the back of your train and you're going around a corner, you can do what's called string lining, where it's where your car will tend to tip over to the inside. If your cars are too light, you hit a piece of bad track, they're going to derail. You can also have string lining problems. I decided on my railroad, I make sure my cars work correctly. I make sure my couplers are good. I make sure my wheels are spin freely, and I don't worry about exactly the weight. For example, on my railroad, you're supposed to do what the real railroad does. If you have an empty open car, an empty gondola, an empty flat car, it gets put at the rear of the train. So I don't worry about adding a lot of weight to empty flat cars. They just have to be handled at the rear of the train. If somebody doesn't pay attention to that, well, they get embarrassed when they have a derailment for not following the rules. So whether or not you choose to make your cars heavy is up to you. If whatever you choose to do with weight, do make sure they're balanced. I had a great idea many years ago. I thought I got my hands on some lead BBs and I put them in the bottom of the car and I put a piece of electrical tape on top to hold them in place. Worked great for a few years. Well, the electrical tape didn't hold. So then the BBs got loose. And of course, these were in cars that were all glued closed. So then you'd have the BBs all shift to one side of the car, and the car would go down the railroad leaning to one side and would derail. Those cars are gone now. So if you are going to use something like BBs, find a better way to glue them in. I found an even easier place to get some good weight if you choose to add weight to your cars. On the right-hand side is coupler wheel weights. You used to be able to go to any tire shop and get those in lead. Well, they don't have lead ones anymore. They have steel, but they're still fairly heavy. They're just not quite as heavy as the lead. On the left is a piece of sheet lead. Years ago, I went to the local hardware store and I bought a 25-pound roll of lead roof flashing. I think I've had it for about 20 years, and I think I still have 20 pounds of it left. So if you're ever in Paso Robles, California, come on by and I'll give you a pound. But what's nice with that is it's a thin piece of lead. You can fold it, bend it, smash it, fit it into the nooks and crannies. I do find it really useful for adding weight to locomotives. Well, that's my ideas on how to keep my rolling stock running good. I'd like to talk for a minute about some of the tools I have found that make my job easier of keeping my railroad operating. So I'll kind of go from clockwise, starting up at the top. There's a Reeboks set of different axle length wheel sets. In the center is a couple of pin vices with the drill bits and the tap from A-line. And then comes those little gimbaled washers. Then some fine screwdrivers. One thing you want to do with screwdrivers is get a good screwdriver so that the tip is properly shaped and it doesn't fail on you, it doesn't wear. And I also magnetize all my screwdrivers. It makes it much easier for holding a screw. Then above that is my favorite brand of super glue, or ACC. We'll look at that in a moment. And then some lead at the bottom, a coupler greasem, a couple of trip pin height tool, and some sprue cutters. So my tools for lots of use: that magnetic tip screwdriver, the tool for cleaning out the wheel journals, some KD greasem, and my calipers. I also use the calipers a lot when I'm building structures to determine what is the actual dimensions of these pieces of material I have. I also like a foam cradle. I happen to cover my foam cradle with a piece of plastic. It's the plastic that a brass locomotive would be wrapped in. Otherwise, fine details tend to get stuck in the foam. Foam cradle makes it really nice to not damage fine details while you're working on a car. Below that, you see my test track. Just some good old Atlas snap track re-railers and 2 KD gauges. Makes it real easy to take any piece of rolling stock or locomotive and rail it, slide it down, check my coupler heights. In the center is a cat food stainless steel dish. A very similar thing you can often get for free with a coupon at Harbor Freight. They give them away every once in a while if you have the coupon. Makes it real nice as you're working on something, someplace to keep all those little parts that otherwise disappear into your carpet or onto your floor. On top of that is my most often used tool is an optivisor. As I aged, I also found that besides don't see so well, light really helps. Well, there's a company that makes this piece that you put on the front of your optivisor that has 6 bright LEDs. It really makes it much easier to look down and see what it is I'm trying to work on. Again, the Reeboks wheels, and then that Loctite super glue. The reason I like the Loctite, the bottle stands upright real easily. The bottle is designed that when you stand it upright, the liquid drains back into the bottle, and that black cap fits really tight. I don't remember the last time I've thrown one of these bottles away that wasn't empty. They don't clog. Another thing about super glue, I live near a guy called Bob Smith Industries. If you go in your hobby shop and you see ACC glue and it says the name of the hobby shop on it, that's from Bob Smith Industries. He sells it with their hobby shop's name on it. I asked him about problems with clogging ACC. And I told him, a lot of people say put it in the refrigerator. He says that is the absolute worst thing to do is putting in the refrigerator or freezer. ACC kicks off from moisture. Inside your freezer is dry, but when you take the bottle out, it condenses moisture out of the air and causes your ACC to go off. He says, just keep the bottle upright and don't put it in the refrigerator or freezer. Another tool I use a lot of is those yellow things on the upper right. Those are little tiny micro brushes. I get them on Amazon. Just put in Amazon makeup brushes. They have a variety of sizes. That's how I apply glue. And I have them in a variety of tip sizes from really tiny to fairly wide. And then the bottom right, you see an upside down medicine cup. Again, it's an Amazon purchase. I think it's like $5 for 100 of them. I turn them upside down, put a little drop of either the ACC or if I'm building a wood kit, wood glue, and then use my little micro brushes to pick up just a little bit of glue to do the job I need to do without making a mess. Having good X-Acto knife blades, start every job with a fresh blade. You can't tell that it's dull, but it really is dull. Have a tool for dealing with those coupler springs. Have a KD gauge. NMRA gauge. Well, I hope this will help you get through some of the problems with your rolling stock. The fun of the railroad is to operate it and to build it. The fun is not dealing with derailments, which always happen when you have guests over. They always happen during an op session. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation, and I'll be around later for the Zoom discussions. Thank you.